of our communities in every state where there has in fact been a disaster. And so we will work with colleagues. We will be offering a bipartisan effort. I am extremely hopeful that we can come together around what really needs to get done, which is a 5-year farm bill. And if not, we certainly will make sure that in September we have the opportunity to work together. And as I close, let me, Mr. President, just indicate the reason for what happens if we don't do the whole farm bill. We lose deficit reduction. The only thing we've voted on in a bipartisan way with deficit reduction, we passed here together, and I see colleagues of mine who played a tremendous role in this. Former head of the Department of Agriculture, Secretary of Agriculture from Nebraska, distinguished senator from South Dakota, North Dakota. We did this on a bipartisan basis. $23 billion in deficit reduction. We repealed subsidies that we all agree that from a taxpayer's perspective we should not be doing anymore. Made some tough decisions on that. We want to make sure that we're supporting farmers for what they grow but not giving a payment for what they don't grow. And the number of reforms that we did around payment limits and other things, including going through every part of this bill and doing what everybody says we ought to do, which is look for duplication, what doesn't work, what ought to be eliminated, and we actually eliminated more than 100 different programs and authorizations. So if we don't do a real farm bill, all of this goes away. And so I suppose you could say the folks that don't want reform would be trying to stop us from passing a 5-year farm bill, certainly the Senate bill, people who don't want reform, people who would like to keep status quo and would like to continue with a system that's not worked for many, many growers and ranchers. So we in the Senate have come together, and we think that's not the right way to go. And I'm committed, working with my colleague, the ranking member from Kansas, who I know cares deeply as well about what's happening to livestock producers in his state. We have talked. I know how committed he is to make sure that we have the right help to be able to support them. We are committed to doing that. But let's not do half a disaster assistance bill. Let's not do something short-term that is less than what producers across the country are counting on us to do. They've sent a loud message. They want us to get it done. There's no reason we can't. We did it here in the Senate. I believe if we work in good faith, we listen to each other, we trust each other, that we can get the whole thing done in September and have really something to celebrate and to offer to all of those in rural America, all of those who count on every one of the 16 million people who have a job because of agriculture and our food industry. So, Mr. President, I yield the floor. My colleague from North Dakota has been extremely patient and very much appreciative of his willingness to allow me to speak.
I'd like to thank the senator from Michigan, and I actually am going to yield to the good senator from South Dakota. I know he has a commitment, and he will be brief, and so I will yield to my colleague from South Dakota.
Mr. President, thank you.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you,
North
Mr.
Dakota
President.
to South Dakota.
I know it's very confusing, and I very much appreciate my colleague from North Dakota yielding to his colleague from the South. I had hoped to come down here to ask unanimous consent to call up and pass Senate Bill 1956 with a committee-reported amendment. My understanding is there is an objection on the other side. I'm disappointed about that. I'd hope that we'd be able to get unanimous consent today to pass what is a very bipartisan bill. It's the European Union Emission Trading Scheme Prohibition Act. It's a bill that passed by voice vote just this week I should say, earlier this week from the Commerce Committee, and a similar measure was passed earlier this year in the House of Representatives by a voice vote. The aviation industry, the administration, consumers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, just about everyone believes that the EU must be reined in, and it must happen quickly. In fact, just this week at the Commerce Committee markup, Senator Boxer, who's the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee, also a member of the Commerce Committee, said, and I quote, "I think moving it," referring to my bill, is critical, and moving it fast is critical, because I think it will send a message to the international organization we are trying to nudge forward to know that this is the way that this is going to be dealt with, end quote. I could not agree more, Mr. President. In 2005, the European Union began their emissions trading scheme, which attempts to cap emissions of carbon dioxide from stationary sources within the European Union. Starting in 2012, in January of this year, civil aviation operators departing from or landing in Europe began to be included in this emission scheme. Now, under this program, any airline, including non-European airlines flying into and out of Europe, will be required to pay for EU emission allowances. Allowances will be collected for the entirety of the flight, including portions in U.S. and international airspace. Now, just as a great example of this unfair application is happening right now, is we've got Olympic athletes that are traveling to and from the London Games by air. One such Olympian is from my home state of South Dakota, Paige McPherson. She's competing in Taekwondo next week. She arrived in London last week, and the final leg of her flight took her from Newark Airport to Heathrow Airport. During this flight, approximately 555 miles of the 3,500 miles flown, or 16%, were actually in EU airspace. But her flight was taxed as if 100% of it was in EU airspace. Now, obviously, this unilateral imposition of the EU ETS on U.S. aviation operators is arbitrary, it is unfair, and it is a clear violation of international law. Plus, it is being done without any guarantee for environmental improvements and at a huge cost to the aviation industry and constituents that we serve. Now, let me be clear that no one in Congress is against the EU implementing this European trading scheme within their boundaries. That's obviously their prerogative, that's their jurisdiction. However, Mr. President, I believe that any system that includes international and other non-EU airspace must be addressed through the International Civil Aviation Organization, otherwise known as ICAO, of which the United States and 190 countries, including all of the EU member states, are members. And that's why I introduced this simple bipartisan bill. It gives the Secretary of Transportation the authority to take the necessary steps to ensure America's aviation operators are not penalized by any system unilaterally imposed by the European Union. The bill also requires the Secretary of Transportation, the Administrator of the FAA, and other senior U.S. officials to use their authority to conduct international negotiations and take other actions necessary to ensure that U.S. operators are held harmless from the actions of the European Union. It is time for the United States Senate to join the House of Representatives and the administration in voicing our strong opposition to application of the European Union's emission trading scheme system to American operators. I'm sorry that it couldn't be done today, Mr. President, because, as I said, this was unanimously reported out of the Commerce Committee earlier this week. We had broad bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans agree this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And frankly, it's one that I think could be addressed in a very timely way. The longer we wait, the longer that we have American air carriers and therefore American travelers paying into a system that there is no guarantee is going to be used for any kind of environmental improvements in Europe. It's in effect a tax on American travelers that would fund European governments, and if you want to put it in a very crass, plain way, you could say that the American public is being taxed to bail out European Union nations. That's as simply as I can put this. It is a violation of international law. It is a violation of American sovereignty. It is an unfair, unjust, and illegal tax. It needs to be stopped. This legislation would allow that to happen, and it's unfortunate that we've got an objection on the other side that will prevent that from happening here tonight. But I intend to work with my colleagues to try and get a vote on this as soon as we return in September. And I want to thank again my colleague from North Dakota for his graciousness in allowing me to make that statement. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President, does the gentleman from North Dakota have the floor?
Mr. President, I do rise on another issue, but I would yield at least temporarily to see what the good senator from Missouri.
Well, I just am concerned that we're going to go home without an ag disaster bill that farm families can rely on. I've got some remarks here that I'd like to insert into the record, but I'd also say that this disaster is real. The disaster programs for livestock ran out a year ago, by September the 30th of last year. We have a chance to do something. We have a chance to do something about that. and I'd like to see us do something about that. The idea that we would decide that we can put this off another month, that we can put those families in jeopardy for another month of not knowing what their solution is, just seems to me to be totally unacceptable, Mr. President, and I would yield the floor back to my friend from North Dakota, but I have some remarks for the record and intend to continue to do everything I can to see that we solve this problem with a real solution, not just another Washington excuse as to why we can't do what needs to be done, and I yield back.
I'd like to thank my esteemed colleague from the senator from Missouri. I appreciate working with him on many issues, including agriculture, and I share his concern. I've been on the floor of the Senate this weekend and past weeks expressing my desire to pass a farm bill, including drought assistance. I believe we can do that. We've passed a farm bill here in the Senate. The House Ag Committee's come forward with a product. We absolutely need to come together, House and Senate, on farm bill for the good of our farmers and ranchers, including drought assistance, and for the good of the country. I rise today to introduce legislation on another matter, important energy legislation for our country. I am today introducing the Hoven, Conrad, Bacchus Coal Ash Recycling and Oversight Act of 2012. In my home state of North Dakota, there's a large power plant just north of the state capital, Bismarck. It's the Coal Creek Power Station. Now, this power station generates 1,100 megawatts of electricity every year. There's two 550-megawatt plants. It's got the latest, greatest technology, emission controls, clean coal technology. They do things like they capture the steam that was formerly exhausted from the plant. They capture that steam and they actually use it to run an ethanol plant. So they produce transportation fuel with steam, byproduct of the electric generation process. One of the other things they do is they also, instead of landfilling the coal ash or fly ash, the coal residuals, instead of just landfilling that coal ash, they recycle it. So in essence, they take that coal ash, they work with a natural resources company, Headwaters, which is based out of Utah, and they turn the coal ash into a concrete product that's called Flexcrete. It's actually a stronger concrete product, and they use it to make roads and bridges and buildings, also products like shingles. So building materials. So whereas they used to take about 600,000 tons a year of coal residuals and coal ash, fly ash, and just landfill it, and it cost, I don't know, $6 a ton or so to landfill it. Now they take that 600,000 tons a year of fly ash and residuals, turn it into building products. So the difference, instead of paying to dispose of something and now being paid to recycle something, is about a $16 million a year revenue item for that plant. That means lower cost electricity for businesses in states like the great state of North Dakota and, in fact, the great state of Minnesota and other states as well. So it truly benefits our consumers, our families, it benefits our economy, and benefits small business throughout the upper Midwest. So it's truly a great example of American ingenuity and innovation. In fact, I've got a picture right here. This is the North Dakota Heritage Center. Right now there's a $50 million expansion being constructed to that Heritage Center, which is located on the Capitol grounds in Bismarck. $50 million expansion. They're using building materials made of coal ash for this facility. And that's what it's going to look like after they do this $50 million expansion. Let me give you another example. This is the National Energy Center of Excellence at Bismarck State College, two-year college that trains people for the energy industry. It's located right above the Missouri River. This beautiful window overlooks the Missouri River. Again, a building constructed with building materials made of fly ash. So you can see how this product is used and how effective it is being used. As a matter of fact, if you look nationwide, by recycling coal ash, We reduce energy consumption by 162 trillion BTUs every year. Now, that's the amount of energy that you would use to power 1.7 million homes in a year. Pretty substantial energy savings. Or measure it in terms of water use. We reduce water use by recycling coal ash. We reduce water usage by 32 billion gallons annually. That's about 1/3 of the total amount of water that the state of California uses in a year. So why do I tell the story? Because right now EPA is looking at changing the regulations of coal ash. They're looking at changing the regulation of coal ash to doing it under subtitle C of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The problem is that's the hazardous waste section. Right now, coal ash is regulated under subtitle D of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is the non-hazardous waste section. And EPA is looking at making that change in spite of the fact that the Department of Energy, the Federal Highway Administration, state regulatory agencies, and the EPA itself have done studies, and those studies have shown that it is not a toxic waste. So now the EPA first proposed this new regulation in June of 2010. This regulation would truly undermine the industry, drive up costs, and eliminate jobs when our economy can least afford it. In fact, according to industry estimates, it would increase electricity costs by up to almost $50 billion annually and eliminate 300,000 American jobs. Let me elaborate. Meeting the regulatory disposal requirements under the EPA's Subtitle C proposal would cost between $250 and $450 per ton, as opposed to about $100 per ton under the current system, which would translate into $47 billion in terms of burden on electricity generators that use coal, and of course, most importantly, their customers who would see their bills increased. And as I said, overall it would cost about 300,000 American jobs for our economy. That is why I'm introducing the Hoeven, Conrad, Baucus Coal Ash Recycling and Oversight Act, which is Senate 1751, and it has very strong bipartisan support. It is truly a bipartisan bill, including 12 Republican sponsors and 12 Democrat sponsors. The Republican sponsors include myself, Senator McConnell, Senator Portman, Senator Bozeman, Senator Blunt, Senator Ron Johnson, Senator Moran, Senator Alexander, Senator Toomey, Senator Grand, Senator Thune, and Senator Hatch. The Democrat co-sponsors include Senator Conrad, Senator Baucus, Senator Cole, Senator Landrieu, Senator Manchin, Senator Warner, Senator Pryor, Senator McCaskill, Senator Ben Nelson, Senator Bill Nelson, Senator Casey, and Senator Webb. And I want to thank them for their willingness to join together in a bipartisan way. 12 Republicans, 12 Democrats come together to provide the kind of energy legislation that's going to truly help move this country forward, empower not only more energy development, but better environmental stewardship. This legislation, which is similar to H.R. 2273, which was sponsored by David McKinley, Representative David McKinley of West Virginia in the House, passed the House with strong bipartisan support. And this legislation is very similar. We've made some enhancements, but it's very similar. The bill not only preserves coal ash recycling by preventing these byproducts from being treated as hazardous, it also establishes, this is important because this is about good environmental stewardship, it also establishes comprehensive federal standards for coal ash disposal. Under this legislation, states can set up their own permitting program for the management and the disposal of coal ash. These programs would be required to be based on existing EPA regulations to protect human health and the environment. If a state does not implement an acceptable permitting program, then EPA regulates the program for the state. As a result, states and industry will know where they stand under the bill, since the benchmarks for what constitutes a successful state program will be set in statute. EPA can say, yes, the state does meet those standards, or no, it does not. But the EPA cannot move the goalposts. This is a states-first approach that provides regulatory certainty. I want to repeat that. This is a states-first approach that provides regulatory certainty, and it's that regulatory certainty we need to stimulate private investment that will deploy the new technologies that will not only produce more energy, but will produce better environmental stewardship. And what is certain is that under this bill, coal ash disposal sites will be required to meet established standards. Those established standards include groundwater detection and monitoring, liners, corrective action when environmental damage occurs, structural stability criteria, and the financial assurance and record-keeping needed to protect the public. Mr. President, this is legislation that is needed to protect jobs and help reduce the cost of homes, of roads, and to help reduce electric bills. I want to thank both the Republicans and the Democrats who have taken a leadership role in this effort as original sponsors of the legislation. Especially want to express thanks to my fellow senator from North Dakota, Senator Conrad, also Senator Baucus of Montana, and their staffs for the hard work that has gone into this legislation, and urge our colleagues to join us in this important energy legislation. Thank you, Mr. President, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it was reported today that Iraq has denied the United States' request to extradite senior Hezbollah field commander Ali Musa Dakduk, who was recently ordered released by the Iraqi court after our government turned him over to Iraqi custody when our troops left the country. The administration had years to transfer Dakduk to our detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, but because the President seemed to lack the political will, I think because of campaign promises he improvidently made, one of our most dangerous, reprehensible terrorists in our custody will likely be allowed to go free. We should never be in this position. I and others saw this coming, and we pleaded with the administration not to allow it to happen. Sadly, our warnings fell on deaf ears, and sadly, we were proven correct. Dakduk is responsible for the torture and murder of 5 American servicemen in Karbala, Iraq, including Private Jonathan Milligan of Locust Fork, Alabama, who was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action as he attempted to defend his comrades in this attack. Dakduk's actions were terrorist actions outside the rules of war. They were wearing American uniforms, an action that he directed. They are against the laws of war, and he's not only to be held and can be held not only as a prisoner of war, but as a violator of the rules of war, could be tried and should have been tried in American military commission. When U.S. forces captured Dakduk, then the most senior Hezbollah figure in U.S. custody, he provided detailed testimony about the support and training provided by Iran to Iraqi insurgents, and he admitted it violating the rules of war. He is not a criminal defendant. He's not a member of an organized crime syndicate or some drug dealer. He is a confessed terrorist who committed atrocities against American soldiers during a war duly authorized by Congress, and that makes him an enemy unlawful combatant who may be detained until the conclusion of the war or subjected to trial by military commission. And he could be imprisoned for up to life, or he could be executed. Once the military determined he was no longer of use for intelligence purposes when he was in Iraq, he should have been brought to Guantanamo Bay. That was a perfect place for him to be detained. This should have been an open and shut case. But President Obama and Attorney General Holder have obstinately clung to the failed law enforcement approach to counterterrorism. They just have. It's been a dispute all the way through the campaign and since they've taken office. They believe in treating foreign enemy combatants as normal criminal defendants entitled to U.S. constitutional protections and civilian trials. This is contrary to history, contrary to the laws of war, contrary to our treaty obligations. The other nations don't do this. The problem began when, upon taking office, the President decided to ban any new additions to the prisoner population at Guantanamo Bay. You remember that. He didn't like Guantanamo Bay. He thought that was some bad place. So if he transferred Dakduk, or anyone else for that matter, to Gitmo, he would anger certain of his supporters and violate some of his improvident campaign promises. One of which was to the effect Gitmo was a cause of terrorism, not a way to prevent terrorism and prevent people from murdering people. So when the report surfaced that the administration planned to transfer Dakduk to the United States for a civilian trial, that was the first report. He would be brought to the civilian trial. My colleagues and I wrote the Attorney General and urging him to reconsider and try him through military commission. And for a time, the Attorney General appeared to have relented. But a few months later, it was reported that instead of transferring him to Gitmo, the administration decided to release Dakduk to Iraqi custody. This time, we wrote to the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Panetta, asking him to reconsider that decision. We warned that the Iraqi government previously had released terrorists who later returned to the battlefield to kill American servicemen. Yet, as the deadline for the United States withdrawal from Iraq approached, it became clear that the President had no intention of removing Dr. Duke from Iraq. The President then struck a deal with Prime Minister al-Maliki to charge Dr. Duke before an Iraqi criminal court for his acts of terrorism, forgery, and illegal entry, and other offenses. Now that the Iraqi court has had the hearing and trial, they've ordered him released, in spite of the volume of evidence turned over by the United States to be used in the trial, including his uncoerced confessions detailing his role in training the insurgents and his role in the Karbala massacre that I've referred to. It appears that it is only a matter of time before he will now be set free. Recent press reports indicate that the Iraqi authorities are trying to find a way to release Dr. Duke without angering the White House or embarrassing the President ahead of the elections. Well, no one should be surprised that Iraq will not turn him over. This was our concern from the beginning. This kind of thing would happen. The administration knew well before it handed over Dr. Duke that his decision, its decision was an abdication of its responsibility to prosecute a terrorist for war crimes against American soldiers, the murder of American soldiers. The administration knew that if the Iraqi courts failed to bring him to justice, we may never get a second chance. That was known. And they knew that Iraq would not agree to an extradition request. That's been their policy. So the fact of the matter is we wouldn't be in this position if we just prosecuted Dr. Duke when we had the opportunity. But now, not only is justice perverted, but he could be returned to the battlefield to kill further Americans, Iraqis, and others. Unfortunately, Dr. Duke was not the first, nor will he be the last example of this administration's unwillingness to convene
it into the congressional record. And this is written from the vantage point of the fallen. We stood so you can sleep, while out across our nation our mothers now so weep. We fought so you can live, all in such blessed peace that which our most selfless sacrifice so gives. As all in such pain and heartache, our families must now so live. We stood so you could sleep upon that bed of freedom so very sweet. As to all of you, our promises we did so keep. As it was for all of you, our bodies now so sleep. So sleep, all in such dark, cold, quiet graves, so very deep. We gave all of our most precious lives, while all of our brothers in arms did so weep and not ask why. As we so raised our hands so way up high, and so swore to pledge our most precious lives to make a stand, to make a difference with it all. As we so gave that last full measure while standing tall. And we died and bled to so keep all of our most solemn vows of honor said, as why out across our nation our families now so weep. All but for the greater good, we so gave all we could as we stood. As we pray now to our Lord their fine souls to so keep, for they so stood for what was right, all with their most brilliant souls so burning bright. As they died all for that old red, white, and blue this sight, as into that face of evil, they so marched off casting their most heroic lights. To so go forth, all in such a most brilliant force to fight. For they'd much rather have died for something than to have lived for nothing at all, for strength and honor was but their most sacred battle cry, call, because moments are all that we so have. To make a difference, to hear that call, to change the world, to go out so boldly with flags unfurled. Troops mount up as heaven calls. Move on, move out, as there are 30 more new angels in the army of our Lord to fight that battle, who shall not pause, to so watch over us all. And when there comes a gentle rain, their tears will wash down upon us, so remain. To ease our pain, so we won't have to cry anymore, as forever in our hearts, your most sacred names we will carry all, because you died so we can sleep upon that bed of freedom, your gift of peace, as now we lay your fine bodies down to rest, to sleep, because you stood. Amen. Mr. Speaker, this very special poem is entered into the congressional record, and it was written by Albert Carey Coswell. And I have the privilege of representing a wonderful district, Mr. Speaker, home of a lot of heroes. And these are good men, and you'd never know how they serve and what they do. We are deeply grateful for their service and for all service members across this great land. We stand with the families of the fallen, our Gold Star families, and we ask that God would give them a special measure of comfort and peace on this anniversary. I yield back, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate you being with us this afternoon and giving me the opportunity to come down here and talk about where we've been in this week on Capitol Hill trying to find a pathway forward. Now, as with every decision that we make, Mr. Speaker, as you know, you and I have been here for 18 months with a voting card in hand, trying to make those decisions for our constituents back home, try to bring their voice to be heard on Capitol Hill. And we're facing one of those choices right here today. Which lane will we choose, Mr. Speaker? We've proposed, passed today here in the House, in a bipartisan way, a proposal that will create 1 million new jobs. Now, I'm going to go on and bring out some other studies and where those jobs are coming from, but one of the folks we're going to hear from that's going to confirm the job creation opportunities that exist in this proposal is going to be President Barack Obama, because he will have stood about 10 feet behind me in a State of the Union address just 18 short months ago and advocated in favor of this job creation proposal, in favor of this job creation proposal. I don't know what has changed in 18 months, Mr. Speaker, but what we saw here on the floor of the House today is our Democratic colleagues advocating for a different choice, a choice that Ernst & Young and an independent analysis of legislative proposals said will destroy 710,000 jobs, that will lose the opportunity to employ 710,000 Americans, that as we are here in what is unquestionably the worst recession in my lifetime. And when presented with a choice between creating 1 million new jobs or losing 710,000 others, we're faced with a choice. The House made the right choice today, Mr. Speaker. The House chose to go create 1 million new jobs, but just in the last 7 days, the Senate made the wrong choice. The Senate chose a path that study after study after study shows us results in failure. Why is that, Mr. Speaker? Why is that?
What I have here, Mr. Speaker, is a chart you'll remember from our budget debate. I'm just so proud. I serve on the Budget Committee here in the House, Mr. Speaker, and you know, we've brought 2 budgets to the floor in the short 18 months that I've served here in Congress. We've brought 2 budgets to the floor that made tough decisions. Tough decisions. When you're running $1.4 trillion deficits, Mr. Speaker, when you're trying to create jobs for a nation that's hurting, when you're trying to prevent job-killing tax hikes from being imposed on American job creators, they're no easy decisions. They're tough decisions, and they have consequences. But this is what we learned in our budget debate, Mr. Speaker. What I have here is a chart that shows tax revenue from 1947, just after World War II, all the way out to 2077. About 130 years of tax revenue, and what we'll see, Mr. Speaker, is tax revenue that's actually come in, represented by this green line, and then the tax revenue that's projected to come in. You'll see that's a flat line. It's taxes as a percent of GDP, and what we see is that whether we've operated America with some of the highest tax rates in history, you know, we've had 90% income tax rates in this nation, 90% income tax rates, or whether we operate America with the lowest income tax rates in this nation's history, we bring in about the same amount of money either way. I know that's not intuitive. I can bring up chart after chart after chart that shows how it's true. I can look at what happened in the Kennedy years when he cut those top marginal rates and more revenue came in. We can look at what happened in the Reagan years when we cut those top marginal rates and more revenue came in. We can look at what happened in the Bush years when we cut those marginal rates and more revenue came in, over and over and over again. But rather than dwell on those charts, Mr. Speaker, I just want you to see that over time, revenue is relatively constant. Americans are willing to give the federal government about 18% of the size of the economy. And if the government asks for more than that, Americans change their behavior so they don't have to give it. The red line, though, Mr. Speaker, represents spending in this country. Spending, again, going back to just after World War II, going out to where we are here today, and a projection forward based on current law. Based on current law, Mr. Speaker. Folks look at this chart and they see this giant red line climbing government spending as a percent of GDP as it threatens to consume all of American GDP, and they think, golly, what in the world, who are the crazy people proposing that we do that? Who are they? Mr. Speaker, that's what happens if we do nothing. If we fail to proactively offer a solution, if we fail to confront the challenges that are facing this country with respect to spending, if we do not act, this is what we get. No president needs sign a law to create this dangerous circumstance. The laws have already been signed. The question is, what are we going to do about it, Mr. Speaker? We don't have a taxation problem in this country in terms of needing to tax Americans more. We have a spending problem in this country in terms of the federal government needing to spend less. And just to put that in sharp relief, Mr. Speaker, I've reflected here in this green the path to prosperity. This is debt as a share of the economy. This is America's debt as a share of the economy. You remember when we had all hands on deck in World War II, when we were literally fighting for the future of the world? Debt crested 100% of GDP. We borrowed an amount equal to the entire size of the United States economy. Well, we're right back there today, Mr. Speaker. We will be over the next decade, and if we do nothing, again, that spending will create a debt pattern that will completely consume not just all of the revenue, it will consume all of the wealth in this country. If we took everything from everybody, Mr. Speaker, if we confiscated every stock and every bond, if we confiscated every small business and every large business, if we took everybody's bank account and took everything out from under their mattress, if we sold everyone's car and everyone's home, we still wouldn't have enough money to pay for the promises that previous Congresses have made to America. It's a spending problem. It's not a revenue problem. But this green line, Mr. Speaker, represents the budget that you and I and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle came together to pass. It's not about blaming folks. Did all of this red line come from previous Congresses before I got here? You better believe it. But it's not about finding out who was to blame in those previous 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. It's about finding out who's going to offer the solution to get us out of that mess. And you know who it is, Mr. Speaker? It's this freshman class that you and I are going to have the great fortune of being a part of. It's the conservatives who have served in this Congress calling out in the wilderness time and time again the senior leaders of this conference and this Congress who are going to come together and provide solutions. This green line represents not just a proposal that one man wrote, not just an idea that maybe 10 or 15 people agree on. This green line, this solution, represents the budget that passed this United States House of Representatives in a bipartisan fashion. Don't let folks tell you it's hopeless, Mr. Speaker. Is it dire? Yes, it is. But we have proffered solutions. We have debated solutions. And we have passed on the floor of this House solutions. The problem is not that taxes are too low in this country. The problem is that spending is too high in this country. And we have offered solutions to that. And that's been the debate on the floor of the House this week. Before I get into the debate that we've actually had this week, Mr. Speaker, I've brought a chart of who benefits from tax loopholes. Who benefits from tax loopholes? We talk a lot about tax loopholes. I'm a co-sponsor of the fair tax, Mr. Speaker. I'm a big believer in the fair tax. It's a fundamental tax reform proposal. It has more co-sponsors than any other fundamental tax proposal in the House or in the Senate. It's H.R. 25 here in the House, and it proposes that we turn our tax system on its head to stop punishing people for what they earn and begin to tax people based on what they spend. If you're going out and you're buying a brand new Mercedes, I don't care what kind of job you have, you can afford to pay the tax. If you're driving a used Ford Festiva, I don't care how much money you earn. You're plowing that money back into the economy instead of taking it out. This is what we see. Who benefits from tax loopholes? The bottom 20%, Mr. Speaker, get next to nothing from tax loopholes. The bottom 40%, Mr. Speaker, you see get next to nothing from tax loopholes. The bottom 60%, the bottom 80% get next to nothing in terms of tax loopholes. The top 20%, Mr. Speaker, that finally starts to show up on the chart. But it's the top 1% of all income earners who benefit the most from all the tax loopholes. In this case, it's just over $250,000 each. Now, why is that? I'm not picking on our top 1%. The top 1% pays about 40% of all the income taxes in this country. The top 1% pays 40% of all the income taxes. The bottom 50% pays zero. And if the bottom 50% is paying zero, that means the top 50% has to pick up the whole tab. We put 40% of that tab on the top 1%. So it only makes sense that if you have a complicated tax code that allows for lots of loopholes, exemptions, deductions, and carve-outs, those loopholes, exemptions, deductions, and carve-outs are going to benefit the people who are paying all the tax. Top 1% paying all the tax, and so top 1% benefiting from all the loopholes. We have a plan to abolish. Be happy to yield.
The chair lays before the House the enrolled bill.
H.R. 5986, an act to amend the African Growth and Opportunity Act to extend the Third Country Fabric Program and to add South Sudan to the list of countries eligible for designation under that act, to make technical corrections to the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States relating to textile and apparel rules of origin for the Dominican Republic, Central American United States Free Trade Agreement, to approve the renewal of import restrictions contained in the Burmese Freedom and Democracy Act of 2003 and for other purposes.
The gentleman from Georgia may proceed.
I thank the Speaker. Why am I talking about those folks in the top 1%? Because I'm not picking on them. I admire them. And I just want to make that clear. I admire them. I'm not one of them, but I aspire to be. I hope I come up with that next great idea like Bill Gates, like Steve Jobs. I hope that I do something that makes a difference for America. I hope that I'm one of those folks who owns a business back home that provides jobs for families, jobs for my neighbors, income that supports people's families. I want to be one of those guys. I don't demonize the 1%. I admire folks who have gone from nothing but the power of their ideas and the sweat of their brow and created something. Golly, that's what America is to me. That's what it is. But there are some in this Congress, there are some down at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Mr. Speaker, who are intent on demonizing that 1%, and what they have now, today, this week, on the floor of the House, has been a proposal to raise taxes on all of those job creators that are in that category. Fully 50% of all the income generated by small businesses is what my colleagues in the Senate, my colleagues here on the Democratic side of the House have proposed to raise taxes on. Those 50% of small business owners who are providing all the jobs, that's where my colleagues believe a major tax increase should be levied. Mr. Speaker, we have put forth a proposal, I'm just so proud, that says rather than raising taxes on job creators, killing jobs, as I showed my choice of two futures, why not introduce fundamental tax reform that eliminates those deductions and loopholes, those carve-outs and exemptions that all of America knows are in the tax code, that all of America would like to see eliminated, and if we know that eliminating those has the greatest impact on the highest of our income earners, why do we need the class warfare that's going on down here on the floor of the House? I say to my colleagues who want to demonize the top 1%, join me in eliminating deductions and carve-outs and loopholes and exemptions, and you will raise taxes on that community because those are the folks who benefit, because those are the folks who pay the taxes. There's a better way. Mr. Speaker, that's not just some hardcore freshman Republican who's a sponsor of a fundamental tax reform bill talking. The President of the United States, this President of the United States, stood not 10 feet behind me at this podium, at that microphone right behind me, and he said these words in January of 2011. He said, over the years, a parade of lobbyists has rigged the tax code to benefit particular companies and industries. Those with accountants or lawyers to work the system can end up paying no taxes at all, but the rest are hit with one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. President Obama said that, and he followed it with this: it makes no sense, and it has to change. Hitting job creators in America with the highest tax rate in the world, it makes no sense. It has to change. This was January of 2011, 1 month after December 2010, when the President signed the tax package for 2 years that the House passed today. I asked the Speaker, where is the contention today? This is the same proposal that was passed 2 years ago, when the President acknowledged the challenges facing our job creators and said it has to change. We have a bigger plan for fundamental reform that changes the debate in Washington forever, but right now we are about the business of stopping the largest tax increase in American history from destroying jobs in this country, beginning in January of next year. The President acknowledges it and said it had to change. He goes on. Right here behind me, January 2011, he says this: so tonight I'm asking Democrats and Republicans to simplify the system, get rid of the loopholes, level the playing field, and use the savings to lower the corporate tax rate for the first time in 25 years without adding to our deficit. It can be done, says President Obama, and he's right. And he's right. And our Ways and Means Committee has held more hearings on fundamental tax reform than any other Ways and Means Committee in my lifetime. And we are talking about those fundamental reforms that the President has asked us to talking about. And this week, Mr. Speaker, we passed a framework that gives expedited procedures. We all know how things get slowed down in Washington, D.C. We all know how easy it is for somebody to latch on to something and stop it from passing because they want to stand in the way of progress. We passed expedited procedures to do exactly what the President has asked us to do. This is not Republican politics. This is not partisan politics. This is folks coming together to try to save what is a fragile economy today. Is it the strongest economy in the world? You better believe it. Is tomorrow going to be brighter than today in America? You better believe it. But not by holding our tongues, and not by sitting on our hands, and not by fighting amongst ourselves about who gets the credit. Mr. Speaker, I don't care. I've got a fundamental tax reform bill that I believe solves this problem. You can call it anything you want to. Call it the Democratic Plan to Save America. It doesn't matter to me. We don't care who gets the credit. We care about solving the problem, and that's what our President charged us to do. He goes on. January 2011, 10 feet behind me. We measure progress by the success of our people, by the jobs they can find and the quality of those jobs, by the prospects of a small business owner who dreams of turning a good idea into a thriving enterprise. My colleagues here are trying to raise taxes on 50% of all the income those small business owners make. The job creators in this country are faced with the largest tax increase in American history. Our President has asked us not to do that. He goes on to say this. By the opportunities for a better life that we pass on to our children, that's the project the American people want us to get to work on together. And we did. We passed our plan for fundamental tax reform together in a bipartisan way this week. Talking about the agreement that the President passed and signed in December of 2010, the very same agreement that we're trying to pass today, he said this: we did that in December. Thanks to the tax cuts we passed, Americans' paychecks are bigger. And these steps taken by Republicans and Democrats will grow the economy and add to more than 1 million private sector jobs this year. Did you remember me saying the President was going to back up, that this proposal was going to create 1 million private sector jobs? He said it in January, add to more than 1 million private sector jobs created last year. I'll close with this, Mr. Speaker. That was 10 feet behind me, January 2011. 10 feet behind me, January 2012, the President said this: we have a huge opportunity at this moment to bring manufacturing back to America, but we have to seize it. We have to seize it, he said. I bolded this so everybody could see it, Mr. Speaker. We should start with our tax code. Right now, companies get tax breaks for moving jobs and profits overseas. Meanwhile, companies that choose to stay in America get hit with one of the highest tax rates in the world. It makes no sense. Everyone knows it, so let's change it. Mr. Speaker, that's the bill the House passed this week. The bill the Senate passed this week continues to punish those small business owners, continues to reward those companies that do their businesses overseas. Don't let an election year get in the way of doing what's right. The President called for it. The Ways and Means Committee delivered it. The House has passed it. We can do it. And I call on my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to believe, as I believe, that tomorrow can be better than today. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, is recognized for 32